Think about the last time you missed a payment. A credit card bill, a medical expense, maybe a car loan? You probably got a letter in the mail, or a polite but firm phone call during business hours. Annoying? Yes. Terrifying? No. Because today, when you owe money, there is an invisible shield protecting you. A strict set of federal rules that says a debt collector cannot call you in the middle of the night. They cannot call your boss and try to get you fired. They cannot impersonate a police officer and threaten to throw you in a jail cell. But here's the thing that almost nobody realizes. That invisible shield? It did not exist until 1977. For the vast majority of American history, if you owed money, there were absolutely no rules. None. It was an unregulated, ruthless, Wild West. And the people coming for your money possessed a level of power over your daily life that would be considered highly illegal, even criminal, today. So, the question isn't just about missing a payment. It is about survival. How did millions of ordinary Americans navigate a system where a stranger on the other end of a telephone could legally destroy your reputation, humiliate you in front of your neighbors, and terrorize your family? And perhaps more importantly, what exactly happened in the shadows of the 1970s that was so undeniably cruel, so out of control, that the federal government was finally forced to step in and stop the madness? The answers to those questions take us deep into a forgotten chapter of American capitalism. A story about the raw, unfiltered tension between a society that suddenly learned to run on credit and an underground industry that thrived entirely on fear. Because the truth is, the protections you rely on today were not created out of kindness. They were created out of absolute, desperate necessity. Let me take you back to a time when owing a few $100s could quite literally turn your life into a living nightmare. To understand how the debt collection industry became so brutal by the 1970s, you have to understand how America viewed debt from the very beginning. For most of human history, owing money wasn't just a financial mistake. It was a profound moral failure. A sin. When the English settlers first arrived in North America, they brought with them a brutal system, the debtors' prison. In early America, if you couldn't pay your debts, you didn't just get a hit to your credit score. You lost your freedom. You were literally locked in a cage until you, or your family, could come up with the money. Think about the bizarre logic of that for a second. You are thrown into a prison cell because you don't have money, which means you cannot work to earn the money you need to get out. It was an absolute trap, and it wasn't just for the poor. Two men who actually signed the Declaration of Independence ended up in debtors' prisons. That is how deeply this ruthless system was baked into the foundation of the country. By the mid-1800s, the physical debtors' prisons were largely abolished. The government finally realized that locking people up for being broke was terrible for a rapidly growing industrial economy. But the shame? The psychological punishment? That never went away. It just evolved. Instead of physical chains, society built invisible ones. If you defaulted on a loan in the late 19th or early 20th century, your name might be printed in the local newspaper for your entire town to see. You were blacklisted by local merchants. You were completely ostracized. The fear of being publicly exposed as a deadbeat was so intense that it kept people in line. The physical prison was gone, but the mental prison was alive and well. And as America marched into the 20th century, this deep-seated cultural belief that debtors deserved to be punished created the perfect breeding ground for an industry that was about to turn psychological warfare into a highly profitable business. For generations, debt was something you avoided at all costs. You saved up for what you needed, or you simply went without. But after World War II, the American economy experienced a seismic shift. The nation was booming, factories were churning out consumer goods, and giant corporations needed people to buy them faster than their weekly paychecks allowed. Enter the plastic revolution. In 1950, the Diners Club card was introduced, followed closely by American Express and the first bank-issued credit cards. Suddenly, the entire cultural script flipped overnight. Debt was no longer a dirty word. It was the ultimate key to unlocking the American dream. You did not have to wait 5 long years to buy a new refrigerator, a modern television, or a car. You could have it all delivered today and simply pay for it tomorrow. Millions of Americans eagerly signed on the dotted line. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, consumer credit had absolutely exploded. The average working-class family was swimming in installment plans and revolving credit accounts. But this massive financial shift created an equally massive vulnerability. When you hand out millions of loans, inevitably, a certain percentage of people are going to default. People lose their jobs. People get severely sick. Life happens. But the big banks and major department stores did not want to look like the bad guys by hunting down struggling families. They wanted to keep their pristine, friendly corporate image completely intact. So they outsourced the dirty work. They passed their delinquent accounts to a brand new breed of businessmen. These were the third-party debt collectors. They did not care about a bank's reputation, and they certainly did not care about your personal circumstances. Their only goal was to extract cash from you by any means necessary. And because there were absolutely no federal laws regulating their behavior, they realized very quickly that the absolute most effective weapon for extracting money was pure, unadulterated, and total psychological fear. Imagine a world where your original lender, the friendly local bank, or the smiling department store clerk, completely vanishes the moment you miss a few payments. In their place steps a ghost. This was the birth of the third-party debt collector, and they operated in a completely unregulated shadow industry. These collectors were not traditional bankers in expensive suits. They operated out of cramped, smoky offices with rows of telephones and aggressive quotas. They worked heavily on contingency, meaning they only got paid if they successfully squeezed the money out of you. Sometimes they kept 30, 40, or even 50% of whatever they managed to collect. Think about the deeply dangerous psychology of that arrangement. If a person's entire livelihood depends solely on extracting cash from desperate, broke individuals, and there are absolutely no federal laws telling them what they cannot do, human nature takes a very dark turn. It becomes a ruthless blood sport. The shadow industry realized that nicely worded letters and polite phone calls simply did not work on people who truly had empty bank accounts. To get someone to pay a bill instead of buying groceries for their children, you had to make them feel something stronger than hunger. You had to make them feel absolute panic. Because there was no Federal Trade Commission looking over their shoulders, and no Fair Debt Collection Practices Act to stop them, these rogue agencies began treating everyday American citizens like enemy combatants. They were not constrained by the bounds of common decency. They essentially functioned as aggressive financial mercenaries. They built highly organized systems of harassment, sharing dark tactics, and trading underground secrets on how to systematically break a person's spirit. They realized that the fastest way to open a wallet was to attack a person's pride, their family, and their sense of basic safety. And what they started doing next to ordinary, hardworking Americans was so shockingly brutal, it sounds like something straight out of a mob movie. Picture this. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. The house is completely dark. Suddenly, the telephone on your nightstand begins to ring. You wake up in a total panic, your heart pounding, assuming a family member has been in a horrible car accident. You pick up the receiver, your hands shaking. But it is not a hospital. It is a man screaming at you about a missed payment on a washing machine. He tells you that if you do not pay by noon, the police will be at your front door. Today, that is a severe federal crime. Before 1977, it was just another Tuesday. This was the era of midnight terror. Debt collectors knew that a person woken up from a deep sleep is disoriented, confused, and highly vulnerable. They exploited that vulnerability without mercy. And because caller ID did not exist, you had absolutely no idea who was on the other end of the line. But the late-night calls were just the beginning of the psychological warfare. Collectors routinely impersonated law enforcement. They would call and aggressively announce themselves as the local sheriff's department, claiming they had a warrant for your immediate arrest. Some even went as far as threatening to call Child Protective Services, telling terrified mothers that their children would be taken away by the state if they did not settle a $200 medical bill. Imagine the sheer, suffocating helplessness of that situation. You could not just block their number. You could not report them to a government agency, because no government agency cared. Your only option was to literally unplug your telephone from the wall, cutting yourself off from the rest of the world. They turned the one device that was supposed to keep you connected to your loved ones into a weapon of daily domestic terror. But as horrific as the phone calls were, the shadow industry had an even darker tactic. They were about to take the terror out of your home and directly into the public streets. If waking you up at midnight did not work, the collectors deployed their ultimate weapon, public humiliation. In the 1970s, your reputation was everything. If your neighbors or your boss thought you were a deadbeat, your life in that community was effectively over. The debt collectors knew this, and they weaponized shame with absolute precision. Imagine walking out of your front door to go to work and seeing a brightly colored ambulance parked directly in front of your house. Or even worse, a dark hearse. Your neighbors are peeking through their blinds, whispering, "But nobody is dead." The hearse has a massive, highly visible sign plastered on the side that reads, "We collect dead accounts." This was a completely real, documented tactic. They wanted the entire neighborhood to know that you were completely and utterly broke. If that did not break you, they went directly after your livelihood. Collectors would aggressively call your workplace. But they did not just ask for you. They would deliberately speak to your manager, your receptionist, or your human resources department. They would loudly disclose your private financial problems to anyone who answered the phone. They would tell your boss that you were untrustworthy, a liar, and a thief. Their goal was incredibly sinister. They wanted your boss to pull you into the office and tell you to either pay the bill immediately or pack up your desk and leave forever. And it worked. Thousands of hardworking Americans were fired simply because debt collectors annoyed their employers so much that it became easier to just terminate the employee. It was a beautifully twisted paradox. They were actively destroying your only source of income while simultaneously demanding that you pay them. There was absolutely no escape. They turned your neighbors into judges and your employer into an executioner. The psychological weight of this public torture was pushing ordinary citizens right to the edge. And eventually, the relentless pressure became so utterly unbearable that something tragically snapped. When you push human beings into a corner, strip away their dignity, and terrorize their families, they do not just magically produce money they do not have. They break. And by the mid-1970s, the American public was breaking in horrific, irreversible ways. This was no longer just about aggressive business practices. It had become a severe public health crisis. The relentless psychological warfare was producing a devastating body count. People were suffering from severe anxiety, clinical depression, and sudden heart attacks caused directly by the overwhelming stress of collector harassment. There were deeply tragic, documented stories of pregnant women suffering miscarriages after being screamed at over the telephone by men threatening to take their existing children away. Marriages that had survived decades crumbled under the daily, suffocating paranoia of the ringing phone. But the absolute darkest reality was the suicides. Fathers and mothers, convinced that they had ruined their families and seeing no legal way out of the torture, took their own lives. They genuinely believed that their life insurance policies were the only way to finally pay off the shadow industry and buy their children some peace. The collectors had literally convinced ordinary citizens that they were worth more dead than alive. These were not isolated incidents. They were happening in quiet suburbs and busy cities all across the country. And eventually, the victims' families stopped suffering in silence. They started writing letters. Thousands of heartbreaking, desperate letters poured into local newspapers, consumer protection groups, and eventually, the mailboxes of United States congressmen. The sheer volume of human tragedy became impossible to sweep under the rug. Lawmakers in Washington, who had previously ignored the dirty reality of consumer credit, suddenly looked up and realized they had a massive, terrifying epidemic on their hands. The shadow industry had pushed too far. And now, the highest levels of the federal government were about to drag these debt collectors out of the dark and directly into the harsh, unforgiving light. Imagine sitting in a wood-paneled congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. In the late 1970s. You are a United States lawmaker, and you think you are just here to discuss some boring, routine financial regulations. Instead, you are handed a stack of sworn testimonies that read exactly like psychological horror scripts. The 1977 congressional hearings on debt collection practices were supposed to be standard bureaucratic procedure. They turned into an absolute national scandal. Lawmakers listened in stunned, uncomfortable silence as ordinary American citizens, teachers, factory workers, nurses, took the stand. These were not criminals. They were everyday people who had simply fallen on hard times, and they painfully detailed how they had been driven to the absolute edge of their sanity. Congress heard harrowing stories of midnight phone calls, threats of physical violence, and families completely torn apart by relentless, unregulated harassment. But the absolute most shocking moments came when former debt collectors themselves took the microphone. These insiders decided to blow the whistle, pulling back the dark curtain on their own highly lucrative industry. They openly admitted to the ruthless tactics they were trained to use. They explained, with chilling calmness, how they were specifically taught to hunt for emotional vulnerabilities. They detailed how they openly mocked people's poverty, impersonated police officers, and intentionally triggered marital breakdowns just to squeeze out a few extra dollars. The politicians, many of whom had been heavily lobbied by banking and retail interests for years, could no longer look the other way. The comfortable illusion that these struggling citizens were just lazy deadbeats trying to cheat the system was completely shattered. It became undeniably clear that this was no longer just about collecting unpaid bills. It was about the unchecked, catastrophic abuse of human beings. Congress realized that if they did not immediately step in and put a leash on this rabid industry, the very fabric of the American consumer economy would tear apart. The government finally had to act. On September 20th, 1977, the terrifying Wild West of American debt collection officially came to a crashing halt. President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, commonly known as the FDCPA. This was not just a gentle slap on the wrist for the shadow industry. It was a complete, structural revolution in consumer rights. The federal government had finally built the invisible shield we talked about at the very beginning of this story. Almost overnight, the rules of the game were completely rewritten. Suddenly, those heart-stopping midnight phone calls were explicitly illegal. A collector could now only contact you between the reasonable hours of 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. The public humiliation tactics? Banned. If a collector called your boss and tried to get you fired, or discussed your private financial struggles with your neighbors, they were breaking federal law. Parking a hearse outside your house? Banned. Impersonating a police officer or threatening to take away your children? That would now land the collector sitting in a federal courtroom. But the most revolutionary part of the FDCPA was not just what it banned. It was the unprecedented power it handed back to the ordinary citizen. For the very first time in American history, if a debt collector crossed the line, you did not have to just sit there and take the abuse. You could legally fight back. You could sue the debt collector, and you could actually win. It felt like a massive, permanent victory for the working class. The era of psychological torture seemed to be officially over. The ringing telephones finally went quiet, and American families could finally sleep through the night. But here is the chilling, undeniable truth about human greed. When you lock the front door, a billion-dollar industry will simply build a brand new window. The 1977 law successfully killed the physical harassment of the past, but it could never have predicted the absolute digital nightmare that was waiting just around the corner. The FDCPA stopped the midnight phone calls and the fake ambulances. But the debt collection industry did not die, it simply evolved. It morphed into something quieter, colder, and infinitely more massive. Welcome to the modern era of the debt-buying industry. Today, massive Wall Street investors and corporate data firms buy millions of defaulted accounts for pennies on the dollar. They systematically resurrect ancient, forgotten bills, what the financial industry chillingly calls zombie debt, and they come hunting. Only this time, they do not need to park a hearse on your front lawn. They already have your entire digital footprint. With the explosive rise of the internet, social media, and global data brokers, modern collectors know exactly where you work, who you are married to, and what you buy. The physical harassment of the 1970s has been entirely replaced by cold, algorithmic precision. They silently garnish wages, freeze bank accounts, and trap citizens in endless, automated legal loops. The invisible shield of 1977 protects you from a screaming voice on the telephone, but it deeply struggles to protect you from an automated system that views your entire life as a tradable commodity. When you step back and look at this entire history, from the cold cells of early debtors' prisons, to the psychological warfare of the 1970s, to the silent digital tracking of today, you realize something deeply profound. The American economy essentially runs on the absolute illusion of freedom. We are constantly encouraged to borrow, to swipe, to consume. But the very moment you slip up, you are violently reminded of who actually holds the true power. Debt is not just a financial tool. It is the ultimate mechanism of social control. The rules of the game may have finally changed in 1977, but the game itself remains exactly the same. If this story changed how you view the invisible systems controlling your money and your life, hit that subscribe button right now. We go deep into the hidden power structures of our world. I will see you in the next one.